We mentioned in a previous episode that we're probably going to maybe be a little bit more frequent with prophecy updates, and this is one of those. And so I thought it would be a good idea to take a look at some of the financial happenings in the world around us. Most of us probably have heard news of the Silicon Valley Bank's collapse and the subsequent backstopping by the Fed in order to given to it in order to cover the deposits by those who had been depositing to it in an effort to keep the sort of the domino effect of a larger banking collapse from happening. And so in some ways, this sort of, I don't call it a handout, but this loan from the Fed, as it were, is just another example of the conditioning that is taking place in terms of learning to rely on government to take care of problems and failures and issues and crises when they come up, looking to the government. Now, this is part of a larger philosophy that has been well articulated by Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum, where he talked about the importance of government and the private sector, public and private sectors, coming together to solve problems that are too big for just the private sector or business and society to handle by itself, but rather to involve government in problems that are so big that only government can handle them. Now, I'm not even necessarily questioning the fact that there are problems out there that are on such a large scale that no number of businesses coming together are necessarily going to solve it. There's not enough collective unity among people to necessarily come together and solve some of these problems. There are some reasons why government does exist, and we can understand and appreciate some of that. However, as a general working philosophy, that government sort of needs to be at the forefront of how society moves forward in order to bring about I'll use the term that's been thrown around so much over the last number of years, a great reset that provides for a paradigm shift in thinking in regard to government, economics, environment, social issues, technologies, and how these things might all come together and serve to provide or create sort of a utopian society here on earth at man's making, and ultimately with man at the head of it. And so we've spent time previously talking about how this really does stand in opposition to that which God has said is coming, and specifically his kingdom coming, Christ coming to return and establish that kingdom one day. I am very much a believer that will literally happen. I do believe in the literal 1,000-year millennial reign of Christ that will be coming one day. I don't think we're in the millennium right now. I don't think that period of time is something we've entered into. I think it is yet coming. So, as often is the case on these posts in regard to prophecy, we often try to examine how it is that we get from where we are today to where the Bible describes the world being when Christ returns. What does the Bible describe the world being like when Christ returns? Well, you can look at places like Revelation chapters 13 through 19. You can talk of which discuss a world, really chapter 6 through chapter 19, really. But if you want a sort of hyper-focused example of the condition of the world right before Christ returns, I would say chapter 13 is a great place to look, because it describes for us a situation where a leader has emerged from a revived Roman Empire, which in itself is sort of a culmination of all of the previous world empires that have sought to gain control. This empire will gain control, I believe, primarily through peaceful means compared to the previous attempts that were much more militarily minded. But nonetheless, at one point, there will be a far-reaching, global-reaching government under the leadership of a person that we call Antichrist. In Revelation 13, he is referred to as the beast. There is a second beast that is also mentioned, the false prophet, who comes alongside of him, both of them having supernatural ability, the Antichrist seeming to come back, whether literally or seeming to come back from a mortal wound, that brings the world about into a place where they are worshiping him and saying, "Who is like him? There's no one like the beast," is essentially what their rallying cry behind him is like. This, of course, is accentuated by the false prophets calling upon the world to develop, to build an idol, an image to this Antichrist that will actually at the power of Antichrist, which is really power given to him, endued to him by Satan, dragon, as it describes. But he will breathe life into this image, and it will cause the world ultimately to take a mark that is both a mark of allegiance and worship. It is an act of obeisance to this first beast, or Antichrist, and also part and parcel with that. And this is where we'll spend some of our time today. It will also include a global economic and political system. We will have no ability to buy or sell, or really, fundamentally, really to participate in this system, short of this mark. That is the number of his name. It is 666, or again, as we've said variously in various manuscripts, 616. But whatever the case, this number is a numeric representation of his name. Whether that means his proper name, as often has been deduced throughout history, Caesar Nero being one of those potential candidates in the minds of many as having been who was in mind when John wrote that. I don't think so. I think actually there is yet a beast coming, an Antichrist coming, yet future, through whom these things will ultimately come to pass prior to Christ's return. But you can read about all that in chapters 13 through 19. At chapter 19, verse 11, when Christ returns, and when he returns, there is a world that is seeking to stop that return, ultimately standing behind Antichrist and the false prophet, who Christ himself summarily dismisses and dispatches to the lake of fire upon his return. The armies of heaven come with Jesus. We will return, as Paul says in Colossians chapter 3. We will return with him in glory, and the armies of heaven will come. But it doesn't really appear from Revelation like we have a lot to do with that return, other than just coming. It's Christ himself and the sword, or the very word that proceeds from his mouth, by which again he dispatches his foes, both sending the Antichrist and the false prophet into the lake of fire. Ultimately, then, those who stood with the Antichrist and the false prophet in their rebellion against Christ are killed during that period of time. Satan is then bound for 1,000 years, and that ushers in then the millennial kingdom. And so this is something I think is coming. But again, the question is, how do we get from the condition of the world today to what the condition of the world will be like right before Christ returns? And I am one of those who does not believe that it will just sort of magically happen like in a second, where all of a sudden the world just suddenly falls in line with the Antichrist when he shows up. Sometimes that is spoken of that way, or it's even portrayed that way in film. There's sort of this just sort of Pied Piper kind of thing that happens. And I think to some degree maybe there's a little bit of that, but by and large I think the world will have been conditioned to receive him when he comes. I think that is both in terms of just practical matters on the earth, politics, economics, and such. The world will move in such a way as to receive him in that regard. But I also think that, without getting into it, because that would be another whole thing, as it has been before, but I think the events of Ezekiel 38 and 39, which I see as preceding the period of time that we're talking about when the Antichrist is on the scene, will likely have something to do with it as well. I think that when God intervenes on behalf of Israel, that will have two effects. Number one, it will cause Israel to recognize that God is intervening on their behalf again. But on the other hand, it will also tell the world that God is intervening in the affairs of men again. And that is going to produce either a happy response by some, but by and large by most, it will likely result in a very adverse response to that, one that would include a willingness to accept somebody behind whom they can say who is like the beast, who is like our guy, who can make war with him. Certainly not this Jesus who wants to return and establish a kingdom, as this dusty old archaic book seems to indicate. So I'm being facetious when I say that, by the way. That is exactly what I think will happen. And I think that likely will be the picture that is continually going to be painted for us prior to Christ's coming. So part of this conversation really isn't going to revolve around things like the rapture and that kind of thing. I do personally believe that we'll be gone before Antichrist comes on the scene for a number of reasons. But that being said, I'm just going to talk a little bit about one particular element in regard to, as relates to the world and its conditioning for the coming of Antichrist and the world's receiving of him. And so as we're watching and waiting and watching unfold, probably is a better way to put this, watching this move toward a globalized, unified political and economic system, as we're watching these things, you may, if you're paying attention to this, I always sort of say that if you're paying attention, I really hope you are paying attention. I hope that if you're new to these posts and you're thinking, okay, well, this is a topic I'd like to learn more about, my hope is that having listened to this or watched it, however you're taking this in, that you will recognize the almost overwhelming shock and awe element to how many things are happening and how quickly they're happening in our day. I am not surprised, but I am surprised. My daughter says this kind of thing all the time. I kind of am, but I'm not. I am, but not surprised that most of the world has no idea what we're talking about when we talk about the things we're going to discuss today. And it's not because it isn't wide open available. Every single thing that I'm going to mention today is something that you can, in about 5 seconds, do some research yourself and pull these things up and read through them. Not in 5 seconds. You could find it in 5 seconds, but you can pull these things up and read them. You can do your own examination of what's happening. You can get a lay of the land for yourself and realize, oh my goodness, this is happening all around me. I think it is entirely probable that 90% of the world is going to wake up one day and all of a sudden find themselves in a completely different world than the one they went to bed to the night before. There's going to be events that are going to take place and that are in movement right now that will one day be just the way it is in this world in which we live. And most people are going to be completely unaware until they all of a sudden find themselves trying to navigate it. Wait a minute, what do you mean my bank account is not really under my control anymore? What does this mean that I have to take a mark? I have to get like a chip or something in order to go into a store and buy something now? There are people that I know who are because of their age and that kind of thing, don't have a lot of technical savvy. And so small things come up that are very challenging. And so they ask for help. And so we help and we get involved and that kind of thing. Well, one day, and part of the reason for that is because they've just sort of been used to doing things with a pen and paper and they've been able to just pick up a phone and call somebody and get an answer to something. But now everything is moving toward being done online. And I don't fault them for that. This is just the world that I actually have one foot in too. And so I really understand it. But I grew up in an era where technology happened on my watch. I mean, it happened in my lifetime. We went from computers being too big to fit into a room to all of a sudden being on our desktops and then laptops. Now everything can be done on a mobile device. And so that all happened in my life. So I remember what it was like before, so I can relate. But I also understand technology enough now to kind of navigate it. But for those who don't, the generation beyond mine, earlier than mine, those that are older than me, all of a sudden are going to find themselves in a place where they are going to either have to just give in to whatever the request is made. Here, come to this place, get a mark, and then this will answer all of your questions. You can go anywhere you want. You can access your money. You can do whatever. Yes, it's true. You'll be tying yourself to this beast and all this kind of thing. And that sounds crazy and extreme, but that's where things are going. And a lot of people are just going to go into it out of just pragmatic necessity because they don't know any better and they don't have any firm enough anchored convictions about what God has said to protect them from that. And so they just go. Others are going to have to find a way to resist that and not take the mark. You remember how in Revelation, the angel, one of the 3 angels flying through heaven, cries out for people not to take this mark. Now, I happen to think that period of time will be marked by a lot of supernatural activity. But if in fact that is intended not to be taken as supernatural and more so as just the power of media and people using media to warn people, whatever it is, there will be warnings given for people not to do that, to take that mark, but people will take it nonetheless. And they'll do so because they just feel like they have no choice. But the Bible tells us that those in that time will have a choice. You can choose not to take it. And yes, it might cost you dearly, but it will cost you your eternity if you take it. And so, but those are the times that the Bible describes as coming and that I would suggest that we're on the threshold of. And the reason I think that is in part, not in total, but in part because of what I see happening around us as we move very clearly and directly toward that description of that the Bible gives us in terms of the condition of the world. in those days. And so one of the things, again, that will be characteristic of the Antichrist is that he will, again, be the head of a globalized government and a globalized economy. Apart from the mark of the beast, you will not be able to participate in these things. You'll be an outcast. You'll be black market. You'll have to find a way to subsist outside of that system because you will have to have that mark to participate in that system. As a matter of fact, another reference that may speak to this, I tend to think it does, but there are those that maybe argue that. But in Daniel chapter 11, verse 43, there is mention of how the king of the north in that time, who historically speaking, in terms of its initial fulfillment, would have been one of the Antiochuses that was involved in ultimately ruling during the time of the end of the Greek Empire and that kind of thing. Daniel deals with a historical narrative in that time, but there are elements of it that do seem to be far forward thinking as well. And one of those passages, I think, is in Daniel chapter 11, verse 43, where it talks about the king of the north having control over all of the gold and the silver and having power over these things, and of all the precious things that are held by the Egyptians during that time. So it is possible that this may also be referencing the far reach of his power and influence over the financial affairs of the world at the time that he's there. But again, I think Revelation 13 makes that case well enough, but just to bring another passage that I think may also speak to it as well. Now, we mentioned at the beginning, most of us have probably heard about the Silicon Valley bank collapse, the Fed stepping in to give loans in order to cover the deposits of those whose deposits were jeopardized by the failing of that bank. There's also been discussion of other banks seeking to buy up smaller banks that may also have been adversely affected. If you read the stories, you see that stockholders and such are not being reimbursed for what they lost. It's just those that have put deposits in this bank and others that are being affected by it. There has been concerns and fears that when banks become available to sell because their stock has plummeted, their holdings have plummeted, their value on the street and in the market has plummeted, that these banks will be eaten up by four major banks, including like Chase and such, that will buy these banks up and sort of consolidate the banking industry into a much smaller group of people in control. So whether or not that ultimately happens, I do think that that's one possible way that may play out. But another thing that I think is for sure playing out is that once again, government is being seen as a savior stepping in to sort of deal with a problem that would otherwise be catastrophic, not only nationally, but even globally, as some European banks are also affected by some of these things. So you want to watch the news and pay attention to those things, because one of the things that will likely happen in regard to moving further and further en route to a single global economy is that there will likely be a consolidating of all finances in the world, starting with, in terms of, or it'll look like likely being consolidated into a smaller number of banks. But and on a national level, that will probably happen all over the world in different countries. But then eventually we'll find ourselves moving toward a consolidated global economy that will ultimately, again, come under the auspices of this mark. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Okay, there's the SVB story is still unfolding. The ramifications of it are still being observed, and so we can't really speak authoritatively to what that's going to look like in a month. But we just sort of watch that unfold, and I would watch that unfold. I as always, I want to warn against getting all crazy and worked up and not taking a good level-headed approach. I would encourage you to read the stories and follow them over time and begin to develop your understanding of where this fits in the overall scheme of things based on an ever-increasing input of knowledge and understanding of what's happening now. We don't want to jump to conclusions. We don't want to run around saying the sky is falling, because that really does hurt our witness and testimony. The things we're talking about here today and in previous episodes where we've talked about these kinds of things, and likely in the future when we talk about them again, are the kinds of things that really are frightening in a very tangible way to people. And so if we can talk about these things in a level-headed way and help people understand how this may in fact connect to the scenario that the Bible paints about the last days, that may in fact open the door for testimony about with the gospel and sharing about Christ and such. But if we are running around crazy and manically panicking over everything, then that doesn't really help our testimony. So when we share these ideas, you'll notice that I'm doing my best. Even though I may get excited about some things, I really try to do my best to make sure that I don't blow things out of proportion or go too far out on a limb without there being some real strong justification for it. So that being said, let me talk about a few things. And one of the things I'd like to do here is to share a few terms and names of things so that they can kind of be in your consciousness. So when you see them on the news, if you read the paper, you watch the news on cable, I'm sure there are still people that read newspapers to find out what was going on yesterday. But whatever the case, however you get your news, when you see these terms and expressions used, it would be good to know what they are and not just sort of move by them because you don't know what they are. So an example of that would be like the expression "build back better." Biden, our president, talks about that as though it's sort of his sort of slogan about some things. But really, "build back better" is a term that has been used really widely by the World Economic Forum long before Biden did. Globally, a lot of leaders like Boris Johnson, Prince Charles, King Charles now, and others of various rank and such in government around the world have been using these terms very, very frequently to sort of plant the thought in the mind of those that we're not going back. In fact, we're going to go further down the road better in terms of, and we're going to intentionally seek to build toward a better society and not just go back to the flawed one before. That's really the underpinning of the Great Reset in that. So, but to hear that term and to understand what it means is important. And so when I mention some of these things going forward here, I mention them in part that they might just become familiar as well. One of these terms I'd like to mention is BIS, or the Bank for International Settlements. This is an organization that's been around for a long time, but is not really widely known to very many. But they are not only a bank per se, but they also are an institution that does a lot of analysis in regard to global economics. And so if you, and I'll put a link as always to some of the articles that I'm using here, and you can go to these sites and you can learn more about these organizations and such. But the Bank for International Settlements again is also in concert with the idea of managing some funds. The idea that they are an institution that does a lot of analysis in terms of global economics. And one of the reports that they have put out, this was about the middle of last year. This is Banking in the Shadow of Bitcoin: the Institutional Adoption of Cryptocurrencies. And I'm going to read a paragraph here that starts off this study. The phenomenal growth of cryptocurrencies raises important questions about their footprint on the financial system. And they're talking about the global financial system. What role are traditional financial intermediaries playing in cryptocurrency markets, and what drives their engagement? Are new nodes emerging, or new points of contact between cryptocurrency and the existing banking industry? We help answer these questions by leveraging a novel global supervisory database of banks' cryptocurrency exposures and by synthesizing a range of complementary data sources for other types of institutions. In other words, we're going to take a look at the way banking has been done, their crossover through cryptocurrency, and those institutions that are, or organizations or nodes or points of contact where cryptocurrency engages. We find that major banks' exposures currently remain at very modest levels. Across countries, higher innovation capacity, more advanced economic development, and greater financial inclusion are associated with a higher likelihood of banks taking on cryptocurrency exposures. In other words, based on a country's sophistication technologically in the banking industry, some countries may be either more or less inclined to adopt and receive and even work within the world of cryptocurrency. As an aside, as a parenthetical, they didn't say this right here in the passage I'm reading, but the United States, a few years ago, Biden himself signed a an executive order thrusting us into the world of learning how to establish central bank digital currencies and how to engage with cryptocurrency and just the whole concept of digital currency and doing business on that level. And so that kind of studying, which likely had already been happening, but now it's sort of the front-facing news story of that, is that the president signed an executive order sort of, launching that. But chances are we have already been well into that for some time. We'll talk about FedNow briefly toward the end, but FedNow is an example, I think, of what I'm saying. This is something that is going to be operational in July of this year. In other words, in a few months, we're going to see this switch flipped on for FedNow, and we'll talk about what that is again later. But we either really got ramped up fast for that, or we've been doing that a lot longer than would generally have been understood. So again, the level of sophistication that countries have adopted and worked toward in regard to banking is what's in view here in this statement. We showed substantial activity is concentrated in lightly regulated crypto exchanges. This shadow, quote unquote, shadow crypto financial system, unquote, serves both retail and institutional clients, such as dedicated investment funds. An uneven regulatory treatment across banks and crypto exchanges and significant data gaps suggest that a proactive, holistic, and forward-looking approach to regulating and overseeing cryptocurrency markets is needed. So the idea of portraying it as a shadow crypto financial system is it sort of implies it's this dark web thing that's happening. But actually, the otherness of the crypto marketplace, of the crypto economy, is really was the main impetus for it, is that it wasn't regulated by governments, but rather it was regulated within its own community, its own economic community. And so as about 3-4 years ago, I think about 3 years ago, the cryptocurrency thing behind people like Elon Musk, who you could buy a Tesla with cryptocurrency now. And once that happened, suddenly there was a whole new level of legitimacy on a far broader scale that crypto was now seen as. And so now it no longer is sort of this other thing. Now it becomes very clear to those in terms of the global banking community. This now becomes something we need to learn not only about, but learn how to regulate and bring oversight to, because it has the potential to do damage to the traditional fiat currency system that we've all been on for so long. And so what this paper is seeking to do is to promote the idea that far more regulation ought to be brought to bear globally upon cryptocurrency. Now, this immediately brings the idea of crypto into the realm that we talked about earlier. This is a global-sized thing that requires some kind of government agency in order to regulate and make sure that it doesn't create an issue. Now, on the one hand, I won't even grant that there's some logic to that thinking, even if there wasn't anything nefarious at all. A sort of rogue economic system that is gaining real traction in the world, and you can get crypto anywhere. Just for fun, I bought $100 worth of crypto on PayPal like 2 years ago, and it's worth like 30% of what it was at the time. So I didn't put much into it, but I just put something meaningful into it just to see if it would turn into anything or just to watch it. Well, it's done nothing but tank ever since I got it, basically. But you can get it anywhere. I'm not trying to promote any kind of financial prowess in that regard in investing. I'm just simply talking about the mechanics of the system. So, this system exists, and it is pervasive enough where the Bank for International Settlements, again, in their analysis, has determined that it's probably high time that we look at how we can regulate this a little bit, or not just a little bit, but maybe even a lot, especially now while the crossing into the financial market of cryptocurrency is relatively small. The footprint is not as big as it will be down the road if it goes unchecked, so now's the time to check it. That essentially is what this opening paragraph to this this study and this analysis is intending to suggest. And so I'm just going to read one more small thing here from this. There's mention here later on in page 3 about blockchain as being the foundation for this, sort of the mechanism for this oversight. Blockchain technology is something that crypto operates on, and also central bank digital currencies, which is a different thing, but it is a digital currency, so they share that similarity. But central bank digital currency, or CBDC, is a different thing than just consumers buying things with crypto. But blockchain lies at the heart, either in reality, I believe, for both. But what's suggested here in the report is that it be the sort of infrastructure behind central bank digital currencies down the road as well. That's the connection I'm making here. But blockchain technology is it's a digital record, or a digital ledger, of all digital transactions that take place within the crypto world. And and it's also spread out and dispersed, decentralized enough where you can't ever get rid of it. And so that transaction history will always exist. And so in a cryptocurrency world, that's great. There's a record and that kind of thing. But it's okay because no one person has control of it. It's everywhere. It's just out there in the community on servers all over the world. However, what's being suggested here by the Bank for International Settlements is that that same technology be used and regulated or monitored or controlled by some governing entity. Throughout the report, there's sort of hints at what that might be and everything, but the fact that there is just the suggestion that since digital currency is becoming a thing, it ought to be regulated by some governmental entity. And since it's happening globally, it's not a far stretch to imagine that there would be some international community board that sort of oversees the global digital economic community that sort of manages that and has that authority to monitor and to interact with and even control that access to that system, or at the very least to look into those transactions and have access to all of those transactions on a global scale. So that's this report. Now the report itself is much longer, and I'll encourage you to read it on your own. I'll put a link to it. But it's BIS Working Paper number 1013, Banking in the Shadow of Bitcoin, the Institutional Adoption of Cryptocurrencies. It's from May of last year, 2022. But it does lend itself very, very cleanly to another report that came out in 2018 by the World Economic Forum that we have posted on our Telegram channel, which I would encourage you to subscribe to, by the way, because we post a lot of these links to these things on our Telegram channel. And you can look at them there. But this report by the World Economic Forum is from May of 2018, the Global Financial and Monetary System in 2030. Now notice I said the report is from 2018, but it's projecting what the economic systems of the world will look like or the system in the world will look like in 2030. So looking down the road, this is the projection for where it's going. And to be honest with you, I would just encourage you to read it. I sat down with my highlighter and I got through like the first section of it and have all kinds of stuff on here that we could talk about in detail. But I'm going to just read again one small section of it that's on page 7 here, where it mentions under challenges, a more decentralized but interconnected system could be a source of increased risks. Managing these will require developing an agile, supportive overall infrastructure, notably powerful and nimble backstops. Interesting, the terminology backstop, it's exactly the term we're using when it comes to the government stepping in to help out Silicon Valley Bank failure. Effective regulation and new crises management tools, while facilitating the implementation of new technologies and not stifling the system's healthy expansion. Now that's a mouthful, a brief mouthful, but basically what it says is that there needs to be an overall infrastructure for this increasingly decentralized but yet interconnected system in order to overcome its challenges. It needs to have effective regulation, and there needs to be new crisis management tools. It is interesting that Klaus Schwab has been talking about how the next major crisis on the global scene will be a cybersecurity attack. And so a cyber attack, in other words, attacking the digital world in which we live, which is a central feature of the fourth industrial revolution that he has been preaching about for years now, and that we're already in. We're already, a foot and like a full foot and a half a foot into it, into embracing many of these ideas. And so, and all the while, this needs to facilitate the implementation of new technologies, but also not stifle the healthy expansion of those technologies or that system. Now, again, I would encourage you to read the whole report. It's not as long as the Bank for International Settlement report I was just quoting from a minute ago, but I would just simply say that, and by the way, I know it's like I'm drawing from two different reports that would not necessarily have links to one another on either of their websites. But because I follow both, I can see how these ideas tie together. What the Bank for National Settlements report is doing is talking about what's going on today, but it's really built upon many of the ideas that existed back in 2018 when this other report came out talking about where the world is going. It's almost like this other report, independent of the World Economic Forum's report, is putting out there a progress report on where we are in these things. Now, remember, there is a master architect behind all of this. It's not just that Klaus Schwab and, the president of the BIS, his name escapes me at the moment, but he's, I believe, an Argentinian guy. But anyway, so they likely do talk together. They likely do have meetings about things. They do attend the same forums and those kinds of things. But even beyond that, there is a master architect who ultimately is moving the world in a particular direction that these things are indicative of. And so when we pay attention to these ideas, it's so that we might be educated to see where we are in regard to the coming together of the world in a one world unified political, social, environmental, economic, and technological global community. Now, another thing I'd like to mention here, we've mentioned before, I'll just briefly touch on here, is the idea again of central bank digital currencies. These exist around the world currently. China is probably the most forward-thinking and most furthest along, I should say, in regard to this. They have a system set up now where people in some cities in China today, as we speak, have access to their funds through an app on their mobile devices that is managed by China's central bank. And access to those funds is based on a social credit score that itself is based upon various elements that today we hear discussed with acronyms like ESG, or Environmental, Social, and Governance criteria or scores. ESG is something that is, like everything else we're talking about here, is well underway and being implemented in various at various businesses and at levels of government. These credit scores based on your environmental, social, and governance ideas and interactions, philosophies, and the way you live your life in regard to these areas, the digital footprint you leave in regard to these things is being accumulated and brought together and kept, so that one day, when our central bank digital currency goes into full effect, one day we will have one here that will go into full effect, and your access to that system will be based on your credit, your score, based on your environmental, social, and governance, again, way of thinking, and also your interactions societally in those categories. It may take form in the shape of you owning a car that runs on gasoline. In a world that is increasingly moving toward electric vehicles. Say you're in California, where this is already starting to happen, and you, in 2036, are still driving a gas car. Well, the idea is for every car certainly every car that's manufactured by 2035, I think, is intended to be an electric vehicle. And let's just say that now all of a sudden they want to get all the gas cars off the road. And so if in January 1st, 2036, you're driving a gas car because there is no digital record of you buying an electric car. They went through all the blockchain ledgers and didn't find any purchases from you on that. And you're still driving a gas car, and you decide your car needs to get fixed, and some garage still exists that hasn't closed yet, and you go there and you want to pay for that transaction. Well, because this system already is in place by that point, the guy at the garage says, well, let me run your card first to make sure you can pay for this. And they run your card and it doesn't take it because your ESG score isn't high enough. You have a carbon footprint that goes beyond the parameters allowed by those who are making those decisions in that time. That's just one example, a very likely example of what that will look like in the relatively near future. So a central bank digital currency operates in a digital currency world where your transactions are all done digitally. Now that's something we already do and we take very much for granted. Most of the time if I buy something and it's on Amazon or whatever, I'm just on my phone. I don't even have to sit at a computer. I don't have to go to a store. I don't have to call anybody. I can get anything I want and I can have it delivered in 2 days or less. And so it's something we all just do. And so to sort of move us further down that road, on the one hand, is majorly convenient, but on the control side, now becomes something that is managed by somebody else. My access to that, that digital marketplace is now in someone else's hands because that's where we've gone. Now, it's not there today, but there's a day coming soon when we can say, well, it's not here today, but it will be there tomorrow, like Saturday. And one day we'll be right there. And it'll happen. And so once the world is completely is completely operating within a digital world in that regard, it just becomes easier now for that to be handed over to a global entity, a governing entity of some kind. Another thing sort of along those lines that you may start hearing more about is what's called SDRs, or what is described as special drawing rights. This is a strange term and doesn't sound like anything. Special drawing rights, what does that even mean? Well, drawing in this context doesn't speak of, sketching something. Drawing in this means like drawing like you would from a bank account, like making a withdrawal or drawing money out of kind of a thing. Well, the special drawing rights is the term that is used to describe something that is not technically speaking a currency like you and I would use, but rather is sort of like it's hard to say it's not a currency, but it's a different kind of a currency. It's a currency that exists among member countries within the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, not the Impossible Mission Force like Ian Hunt in Mission Impossible, but rather this is the International Monetary Fund. You have to sometimes be careful about these terms because if I say things like the SEC in one of the high school classes I was teaching, they're not thinking Security Exchange Commission, they're thinking Southeastern Conference. So you want to make sure you define what these terms are sometimes. They can be confusing otherwise. But IMF in this context is not some hidden government agency, but the International Monetary Fund is what's in view here. And the International Monetary Fund operates among all the nations of the world that participate with it. And the special drawing rights is what they call the currency that they use among the member states, and the value of that quote-unquote currency is based upon 5 major countries' currency. The United States, China, Japan, Great Britain, who else? I put it down here. So we got the U.S., the euro. Of course, the euro, the U.S. dollar, the euro, Chinese renminbi, the Japanese yen, the British pound sterling. And so these 5 currencies, a basket, in sort of basket fashion, they determine the value of the special drawing rights as they are then dispersed to other countries. And those countries have access to those, in times of crises, those countries have access to those special drawing rights, and they are converted to a currency at that point and used to deal with whatever that crisis might be. And so it is thought by some, and I can see the potential in this, it is seen by some that this SDR, the special drawing rights, will sort of create a basis from which the global currency one day will likely be born. The bedrock, really, for what will one day be a global currency. It's sort of a hybrid thing because it's a currency, but it's not a currency. And it's under the regulation of the IMF, but yet it has its value is based upon a very particular group of nations. So it has it smacks a bit of something that sort of is like a type of what will be sort of the global currency one day. It's when you look into this, it's really not hard to see how you could move to that as sort of the perceived currency on a global economic system. So that one I just I want to put out there so that you would look into it and come to understand it yourself, because I do think that is something that we're going to be hearing more about in the days ahead. As we're getting close to bringing this in for a landing, I said before I would mention FedNow. FedNow, we've talked about this. We had a post specifically set aside to describe what that is. But in brief, FedNow is a system that is managed by the Federal Reserve Bank. The Federal Reserve Bank is actually a Federal Reserve system, and that's an important thing to know. It's not just that there's sort of this entity called the Fed. There is, and it's run by a presidentially appointed cabinet level kind of a position. I don't think it actually is a cabinet position, but it's essentially it operates as though it is, because it is the top position in that area within our financial system, and that person is appointed by the president. It may be that it is a cabinet position, but I don't know that I've ever seen where it's been directly correlated that way. But anyway, so the Fed is an organization. The Federal Reserve is a bank, but it's really just the hub for what is the Federal Reserve System. And the system, is one that is sort of a hybrid governmental but government run but not government run entity. It is intended by design to be an independent bank. It's not supposed to be regulated or commanded by the government, but is supposed to function independently. This was put in place under Woodrow Wilson in 1939 under the Federal Reserve Act. But this is supposed to function as an outside entity, so it is sort of free from political influence. It doesn't require Congress or the president necessarily to make its decisions, although it was put out there by the Congress. Ultimately, the law was passed and such, but it functions as intended to function independently. So they have put together a system now called FedNow that, again, in brief, is intended to be a complete reworking of our banking system away from the one that's been in place since the beginning, basically, since Alexander Hamilton, basically put it together. And now, in the digital age, it's intended to be a paradigm shift in the way that we do banking now. And from the consumer-facing side, it is sold as a very, very convenient, fast, instantaneous kind of a system that is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And there is no closing down. There may be bugs in it early on where maybe it has to shut down for a day or two. Who knows, once they flip the switch, how it'll function, how flawlessly it'll function from the start. But the intention is that it would be open all the time, every day, all the time. So that when you make a purchase, there's no waiting a day or a week or something. There's and from a consumer side, that sounds wonderful. And it sort of eliminates a certain level of the middle strata of the economic system. Again, there are charts out there that sort of describe how this thing works, and again, you can. I'll put a link to the post that we did on it, where there are some links there you can follow as well. But this system is now going to start in July of 2023. In other words, a few months from right now. This is March 17th right now, and so it's going to be starting just in a few months down the road. And so that is going to change the way banking functions, at least in some elements, at a fundamental level. And my view, along with a lot of other people, is that this is a very clear step in the direction that will one day result in a central bank digital currency, an essential bank overseeing the digital currency here in the United States. This is a stepping stone toward that ultimate goal. And that, just to reiterate in closing, is that goal is to have a centralized digital banking system that is managed and controlled by the government, where the government would have access to all of the transactions that take place. We sometimes in economics classes talk about things like the underground currency or an underground economy. That would be things where purchases or goods or services are purchased outside of the normal, like brick and mortar or digital marketplace. Like a kid comes over and cuts your grass every week and you give him $30 a week. Well, you don't really have a record of that other than your lawn is cut, but there's no receipt given. There's no, the kid may or may not be reporting that on taxes of any kind, or it's just something you do. Or a garage sale. You go to a garage sale and you buy a bunch of stuff and you take it home. Well, there's no record of that transaction. There's no receipts. There's no paperwork trail or anything. There's no digital footprint of that. You just had a few bucks in your pocket. You want to go shop in a garage sale. You bought something. Well, that's the underground economy. There are nefarious things like, kidney sales on the black market or something. Those things do exist. But, a digital economy and a move away from a papered economy like the World Economic Forum projects is going to happen. There's going to be a continual move away from an economy that's based on paper money and becomes more and more digital, which again is what the Bank for International Settlements is preparing for. Like, how do we regulate and oversee that kind of thing? The reason they're talking about it and the reason they're concerned about it is because it's happening. And that kind of leads me to where I want to kind of wrap up here. The elements of this unified global economic system are coming together right now. This is not something that is in any way theoretical anymore. This is live ammo now. This is happening right now. There's an enormous amount of money globally has been put into moving in this direction. An enormous amount of man-hours has been spent putting this together. An enormous amount of equipment and technology has been brought to bear to make this happen. There is no turning back. There's no one's going to just say, I guess we're not doing this anymore. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but at this point, the old expression would take an act of God. It literally at this point will take an act of God, because this is where the world is going. It has been the end game for a very, very long time. And we're living in the days where these things are happening very, very rapidly and in real time, whether or not people are aware of it. And chances are you can go to a restaurant, have dinner with, pick 20 of your closest friends, and it's entirely possible that 18 of them will have no idea what you're talking about. But this is happening, and one day they will wake up and find themselves in a world where this store they went to for the last 20 years isn't taking paper money anymore. It's already happening with coins, right? Like, you were a coin shortage and all that kind of thing. Well, one day you're going to find that paper money is not really accepted anymore. It's going to all be your debit card or credit card or some app on your phone, or one day a mark or a chip on your right hand or forehead. This is the connect the dots from here to there. And it's happening right now. And we're well into it. Both in terms of the technology and in terms of the conditioning of the global population, in terms of their willingness and readiness to receive it. And it would not take long to make a case that literally every country on earth would see this as a benefit. You're in deep dark Africa where you have no access to food, water, grocery stores, all that kind of stuff. Well, the UN can put a grocery store there, but you need to have this access device, maybe a chip in your hand or your forehead or something, where you can then walk into that store and get what you need, and it will take a digital record of what you took so that we can make sure we replenish it there. In a world that is moving toward equity, it's not hard to imagine that we might have some entity out there taking a global tax collection to produce such places for such parts of the world. And again, fundamentally, I'm not opposed to the idea of providing for people that have needs, but that's another whole economic thing. But that is a picture of what that could look like. We're not far from something like that, some version of that taking place. And so whether it be conditioning or technology, both of these things are so well underway that if you're looking for where we cross the line, you'd have to look behind you like 1,000 miles. We are really, really well into this. And something to recognize about this, I kind of mentioned it before, but this stuff is happening in plain sight. I didn't have to look far to find either of these at all. A lot of people have never heard of the Bank for International Settlements. You will hear about it more and more because it's an entity that is very far-reaching, and it's a lot of people are listening to what they have to say because of the research they do and the analysis they give. And so you're going to hear about. As a matter of fact, I've heard of the BIS mentioned on news channels before, and whereas a year ago you never would have heard about them. So I think that's going to become more frequent. Of course, now the World Economic Forum is mentioned on local network stations periodically based on the story, but certainly on large major network cable stations. Everybody talks about the World Economic Forum. There's nothing hidden about these organizations or what their intentions are. And by and large, depending on the news source that you do follow, there is very little resistance to the ideas that are being put forth there about globalization, bringing the world together under a one world, we are the world kind of a mindset, kind of a thing. And again, I just quoted a song from 30 years ago, something like that. Was part of our vernacular back then. Conditioning has been going on for a very, very long time. I would argue all the way back since Genesis 10. But certainly in modern days, it's not hard to follow that back too. You can also get this information all right from the horse's mouth. You don't have to go to some Christian prophecy, tinfoil hat wearing guy. You may be thinking that's what I am, but you don't have to do that. Like, you don't have to just hear me say it. When I put the links on there, they're the links to that organization. Not to someone talking about that organization. That's what this link is. You're watching somebody talk about those things. But I'm inviting you to go right to the source and look at those reports yourself. Go to their YouTube pages. Go to their websites and watch the videos that they put out. Notice the investment that has gone into producing this work. Not mine, but the folks that are putting this stuff out here. Note the amount of effort and resource that went into putting these ideas out there and propagating them. Think of the cost of the conferences they hold where they gather leaders from over 190 countries to discuss these ideas. That is no small thing. And there are like a dozen of these global conferences during the course of a year. This is completely out in the open. You could make the case that 20 years ago, there was a small handful of people that really had to go looking for this stuff, and so you always wondered if they were making some of it up, or maybe it's a backroom conspiracy theory thing. Nowadays, it is so completely out front and out in the open that you're literally tripping on this stuff. I'm not kidding you. This might be the first time you've heard of the World Economic Forum or the Bank for International Settlements, or it might be the first time you've heard someone describing these things. But I promise you, when you start looking for it, it is everywhere, and I mean everywhere. There's nothing about this that is hidden. There's nothing at all that people are trying to hide about it, but by and large, all of this stuff is right out there in the open, and you can go right to the horse's mouth, and you can get it for yourself. You don't have to take a single one of my words for it at all. The danger, though, the problem is, and this is where I really kind of bring it in, is that most people don't care. Most people either don't care at all, or on the other end of the spectrum, they are so overwhelmed at hearing all this stuff that they just want to wish it's not true. They just want to hide from it because they assume that it'll just go away, or maybe one day I'll just wake up and the stuff will all be in place and it'll all be good and all that kind of thing. Well, I promise you, if you're one of those that wake up one day and find that it's good and you've taken the mark and all that kind of thing, then you're lost. You're gone. You're history. You're done. So that's why we talk about it now, because the day is coming when your choices are going to be binary. You're going to either accept this or you're not. And if you accept it, in other words, if you buy into that system at the time, if you buy into that global leader, you buy into that mark, then even as that angel said, you will be lost for all eternity for it. And this is where you and I as believers connect to these ideas. You and I should hear and consider and synthesize these ideas, understand them. Again, not go running off the edge of some limb somewhere, but just get a good faith, solid understanding of what these things are and how they play into what the Scriptures have to say. We judge them by what the Scriptures say. The Scriptures describe a world that, like we talked at the beginning, under the leadership of a one-world leader with a global economy and political system and even religious system. And that will be what happens one day. We know it because the Bible is something like 100% right all the time about prophecy. I'm being wildly facetious. Of course it's correct about prophecy. It has a perfect track record in regard to prophecy. And so when it talks about last things, we don't want to set that aside and act as though somehow this is different. And I would even suggest, with respect to my amillennial brothers and sisters out there, those that have a more spiritualized approach to what the text has to say in regard to these things, I would say that I have to believe it is getting harder and harder to hold that position in light of what's happening around us. The Bible is pretty clear about what that's going to look like, and I mean like really clear about that. And so I would just hope that as a believer, that you would recognize and just take some time and look at what's going on in these different agencies and institutions and organizations, and recognize what's happening in the world in which you and I are living right now. You and I, as believers, are here, and I'm speaking just generally now to Christians, you and I are here for such a time as this, much like Esther in her time. You and I are here for such a time as this. And we ought to know what's going on around us because it should give us a sense of urgency in regard to the mission that we're on. Jesus said in Matthew 28 to go forth and to make disciples of all the nations. So as we go out, as we share the gospel, as we pray for those around us, to understand where we are on the time clock should build in us a deep sense of urgency. We should not look at this and just run away and escape and just say, I'm going to go hide on an island somewhere and just wait for all this stuff to come down. That's not the Christian call. That is not the Great Commission. That is not in any way something that the Bible would advocate for ever at all, and doesn't advocate for it. Rather, instead, you and I need to remember that you and I are on a search and rescue mission, and that we have a call from God to go and make disciples. People that follow Jesus, people who know, love, and follow Jesus with their lives. Those who come and put their trust in Him and are genuinely born again and are now citizens of heaven, citizens of the kingdom even, and no longer just citizens of this world, but now they have a dual citizenship, the one where their heavenly citizenship ultimately overrules all others and becomes the one that matters most, and we start using our other citizenships to help us in regard to serving that primary citizenship and the king of that place that we now belong. And so please don't be dispassionate about this. Please don't be turning the other way and just hoping it all goes away. I will say that if the other team on a football field left the playbook at the 50-yard line and just walked away, you'd be a fool not to go get it and pick it up and look at it and see what their plays are and see what they're going to run and what they do on fourth down. And what do they, like you want to get involved in that and you want to read it and understand it so that you can know what the enemy's strategy is going to be. Well, not only does the Bible tell us that, but they themselves have said we're not going back to the way things were. We are going to build back better. Books like COVID-19 and the Great Reset, books like The Fourth Industrial Revolution, books like Stakeholder Capitalism. Those are just a few by Klaus Schwab, is just one. There are others that you could look at as well. But these are the playbook of those wanting to bring that about. It's right there for us to read. Now, some people who are influenced by them are going to read that and say, yes, let's go. But those of us who know better, and where our playbook, which also is laid out for anyone to read, we're going to look at that and say, okay, well, we realize this is diametrically opposed to what God has said. And so therefore, here's what's going on, and here's what God said it's going to look like as it gets close to Jesus returning. And so we've seen their playbook, and we also have our own. And with that in mind, we can have a game plan for moving forward in the days that remain for us. Now, there's not a one of us that is guaranteed another breath. And on top of that, and I said this wouldn't be a thing on the rapture per se, but whatever your position on the rapture, there will come a time when you and I will be snatched away and brought into the presence of God, and we'll be home. We'll be out of here, as it were. And so we don't know when that's going to be. So what do we do in the time between now and then? Well, again, I would suggest that we don't go hide somewhere. We don't go cloister ourselves away somewhere and just wait for it all to come to pass. No, if Jesus gave his disciples marching orders right there on day one, then clearly here, 2,000 years later, that call is stronger, not lesser. The time is getting shorter, not longer. And so therefore our responsibility becomes all the more great and important. Not more important than theirs was, obviously, but the urgency of it becomes even far greater now. Acts chapter 2, Peter tells us we're in the last days. We've been in the last days since Acts chapter 2. Well, the end of the last days is coming, and so therefore we ought to be mindful of that and recognize what God would have us do in these days in which we live, because once again, you and I have been called for such a time as this. So I hope you found some of that helpful. Again, links will be there for you to do some homework and some looking. Look for more prophecy updates. Probably most of them are going to be a lot shorter than this one. I'll probably just take a headline or a topic and something like that and just share a few thoughts on it more often than do a whole hour-long diatribe. But I do hope that you found it helpful. So that being said, let me pray. And Father, we just thank you that you've given us your playbook. And we thank you that you've even seen fit to have the other side leave their playbook laying out there on the 50. And so we just pray that we would not be ignorant to these things. Even as Paul said, we're not ignorant to his devices, to the enemy's devices. Well, that's a broad subject, certainly in terms of his seeking to upend us and trip us up in temptations and cause us to sin. But Lord, he has a game plan. There are, in fact, doctrines of demons and such, as Paul would say in talking to Timothy. Help us to recognize that he also has a game plan that we see come to fruition in places like Revelation 13 through 19 and other places in Scripture. Father, we don't want to be ignorant to these things, but rather we want to read them, understand them, pay attention to what's happening in the world around us, and let you, by your Holy Spirit, motivate us and invigorate us to be about that commission you've called us to, and also to be about the business of deepening our own relationship with you. These are not two different somehow dichotomous things, but rather instead to pour ourselves into our relationship with you drives us to share that loving relationship with others, that they might enter in and know you as well. So, Father, we pray that the urgency of the hour would not be lost on us as we seek to go down that road. So thank you, Father. We love you and praise you. Ask for your Holy Spirit to overflow us, just baptize us to overflowing, that we might be empowered for that work in our day that is so necessary as we look forward to Jesus coming for us. So thank you, Lord. We also would pray, in closing, just as Jesus taught us to, may your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Amen. Amen. Well, if you have any thoughts or questions of your own, I invite you to share them in our comments section, or if you want to email me at info@calvarychapelfranklin.com, you can do that as well. So thanks for watching and listening. As always, it means a lot that we can spend this time together, and I do pray that that the Lord would bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you and give you peace forever. And so God bless you, whether it's here, there, in the air. We'll see you soon.